If you were in a cult, how would you know it? I mean, really think about that for a second, because nobody joins a cult thinking, yeah, this is a horrible idea. Nobody wakes up one morning and says, you know what I need in my life? Total psychological manipulation and blind loyalty to a leader. That's just not how it works. People who end up in cults think they're part of something important, something meaningful, something bigger than themselves. Sometimes they think they're part of something, I don't know, patriotic. And from the inside, it doesn't feel extreme. It doesn't feel dangerous. It feels normal. It feels right. It feels like everyone else is the one who just doesn't get it. Which raises a pretty uncomfortable question. What if the defining feature of a cult is that the people inside it don't recognize it as one? What if it doesn't look like robes and compounds and secret rituals? What if it looks like something you see every day? Because today we're going to talk about how cults actually work. Not the Hollywood version, not the exaggerated made-for-TV version. The real mechanics, the patterns, the behaviors. And yeah, we're going to apply that directly to the MAGA movement. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Your Neighbor on the Left, a podcast where we talk about progressive politics, human decency, and life on the blue side of America's ideological divide. My name is Don Spielis, your host. And today I'd like to try to have a calm and realistic conversation about the characteristics of cults. And yes, whether or not there is any correlation between those traits and the MAGA movement. My goal is not just to spit out accusations, but to see if there are actually lines of connection behind all the jokes and memes. All right, so before we go any further, let's get one thing straight right off the bat. This episode is not about whether people support a politician strongly. People have always supported politicians strongly. That is not new, and it's not unusual. And to be honest, it's not even particularly interesting. What I'm talking about here is something different. I'm talking about the point where political support stops being about ideas or policies or even outcomes and starts being about something else. Something closer to identity, something closer to loyalty, something that starts to behave less like politics and more like a belief system that doesn't respond to reality the way you would expect it to. And if I'm able to point out that shift, it's going to be hard to unsee it. So let's start with something simple, something visual, and something that I'm sure you've all definitely noticed. Political merch. Now, before anybody jumps out of their chair, no, it's not new. Political merch has been around for a long time. Campaign buttons have been around forever. T-shirts, bumper stickers, yard signs. This is all part of the normal rhythm of American politics. You get close to an election and a lot of people pick a side. They show support. That's been happening for decades upon decades. But here's the thing. Historically, that stuff was tied to campaign season. It had a beginning and it had an end. You'd see signs go up. You'd see the shirts come out, elections happen, and then slowly it all fades away. You know, bumper stickers probably linger a little longer, but for the most part, the intensity drops off by the time you get to the holiday season. It was support. Temporary, situational, and context dependent. Now, of course, the whole concept of election seasons, they have grown quite a bit since, you know, the country was founded, that's for sure. But even with that, what we're seeing now is not that seasonal, centered on the election sort of support. Now you've got people wearing political gear year round, not just during the election cycles, but all the time. Hats and shirts and flags, and, you know, not just one or two things, but layers of it. You see it on trucks. You see it on houses, multiple flags and banners and decals, entire visual environments built around a political figure. Now, think about that for a moment. It's not built around a party. It's not built around a set of policies. It's built around a person. And it doesn't stop there. There are themed parties and events, weddings, people incorporating political branding into major life moments. And that's not just, I support this candidate. It's something else entirely. It's identity. That's signaling not just to yourself, but to everyone around you, this is who I am. And that's where this whole thing starts to shift. Because one of the things you see in high control groups that people often describe as cult-like, is the use of visible markers of belonging. Things that say, without words, you're one of us. And the more constant those signals are, the more they reinforce the identity. It's not just something you think, it's something you wear, something you display, something you live inside of. Now, to be clear, and this matters, this does not describe every Trump voter. It doesn't. There are plenty of people who voted for Trump for reasons that don't have to do with identity or loyalty or any of the things that I'm talking about here. What I'm focusing on here is the hardcore MAGA subset. The group where these behaviors are the most visible, the most consistent, and the most intense. Because that's where this pattern shows up most clearly. And here's the key distinction, the one that everything else in this episode is going to build on. This isn't about the existence of the merch. It's about the intensity of it, the persistence of it, and the way it moves from something you do to something you are. Because once political support becomes part of your identity, it becomes a lot harder to question anything about it. A lot harder to step back from it. A lot easier, if not compulsory, to defend it no matter what. And that's where things start to get interesting. Okay, so now that we've got that first piece out on the table, the shift from support to identity, let's move up a level. Because it's not just happening at the grassroots. You see it at the top, too. And honestly, this is one of those things that it's even more noticeable to anyone who pays attention to things than the everyday stuff from the everyday voter. Watch Republican politicians talk about Donald Trump. And I'm serious. Don't focus on what they're saying at first Just start off by listening to how they say it. It's not just simply agreement. It's not just simply support. It's praise. And not just casual, yeah, I think he did a good job kind of praise. We're talking about language that feels inflated, over the top, almost theatrical. The greatest president in the history of the country, historic leadership, unprecedented success. And this happens in moments where the context really doesn't call for that level of enthusiasm. And here's the thing, that tone isn't just coming from one person or a couple of people. It shows up across many politicians, different interviews, different settings, but it has a very similar feel to it. It's not random. It's a pattern. We've even seen, since the inauguration in 2025, multiple cabinet meetings that were filmed or televised and started off with a round table, person to person, take your turn, where each person would just talk about how wonderful their boss was. And again, not in the normal ways about this policy's good and that decision was good, but effusive, almost groveling support from each cabinet member before any business was covered. Now, to understand what's going on here, there's a concept from sociology that I think helps to explain it. It's the idea of charismatic authority associated with Max Weber. In plain English, what that means is this. In some systems, authority doesn't come primarily from institutions or rules or even ideas. It comes from a person, their personality, their presence, their ability to command loyalty. And when you have that kind of authority, the relationship between the leader and the followers starts to shift. Because now it's not just about agreeing with policies, it's about demonstrating loyalty to the person. And one of the ways you demonstrate loyalty is through public affirmation, through praise, through making it very, very clear, especially when you're in front of an audience, where you stand. Now, in normal politics, yeah, you'll see politicians back each other up. That's part of the game. But there's usually some variation, some daylight, some willingness to disagree on smaller points. What you're seeing now feels different. It's uniform. It's consistent. And honestly, it's a lot more personal in the type of things that are being complimented. Think about how often criticism, even the mildest criticism of Trump from within his own party, is followed by immediate backlash. Think about how quickly someone can go from ally to enemy just for a single comment. And right there is the incentive structure. If you're a Republican politician right now, your political survival, your base, your support, your future depends, at least in part, on how you're perceived in relation to Trump. So what do? You don't just agree, you affirm. You make it clear over and over and over again that you are loyal. You are on board. And that's where this starts to connect back to what I was talking about earlier, because now you've got two things happening at the same time. At the base, you've got identity signaling. People integrating this political figure into their daily lives and their homes and their self-image. And at the top, you've got almost daily loyalty signaling. Politicians reinforcing that figure through repeated, often exaggerated praise. That's a feedback loop. Top reinforces bottom, bottom reinforces top. And in the middle, the leader becomes the focal point. Policy doesn't matter. Just identity and loyalty. Now again, this doesn't mean every Republican politician is sitting there and thinking, I need to perform loyalty like I'm in some kind of system. That really isn't how the thought process works. Most of this is driven by incentives and pressure and alignment with a base that already feels strongly. There was even an interview recently with Chris Christie, the former governor of New Jersey, where he talked about how a lot of the things that you hear from Republican politicians are only said on camera, and that behind the scenes, when they have one-on-one conversations amongst themselves, they're able to be a bit more honest about the boss. But again, when they're out there and the cameras are rolling, they sing a different tune. Now, the end product that you see from the outside is a system where support for a political leader is expressed less through debate or policy discussion and more through affirmation, through praise, through making sure everyone knows you're on the right side of the person at the center of it. And now that that's become the norm, it raises a question. If support is no longer about ideas, if it's mostly about showing loyalty to a person, what happens when that person says or does something that doesn't line up with reality? So, what happens when a leader, someone who sits at the center of all this identity and loyalty, says something that's just out there? In a normal political environment, the expectation is pretty straightforward. A politician says something that's inaccurate, it gets corrected. Maybe they walk it back. Maybe their supporters adjust their understanding. There may be some friction, some back and forth, some acknowledgement that, yeah, that didn't quite hold up. That didn't quite land. It's not perfect, but there's at least a shared understanding in the scenario I'm describing that reality matters, facts matter, evidence matters. Now, watch what happens in this dynamic, because it does not follow that pattern. What we see now is something else, something that has adapted and is ultimately flexible and self-protecting. So let's walk through it. A statement gets made, something that's demonstrably false or at least highly questionable. Take, for instance, the recent situation where President Trump announced on Truth Social that he was planning on wiping the entire civilization of Iran off the map. Now, the first response to this kind of thing would normally be everyone saying, oh, that's fake news. Right out of the gate, the source of the information gets discredited. Not the claim, but the source, the messenger. But in this particular case, it was Truth Social. So once we've established that it was actually a post, more information has come out, more evidence. Now the response shifts. You say, well, you're taking that out of context. You're misconstruing his meaning. So now they're not denying that something was said or posted. They're reframing what it meant. Then maybe the contradiction becomes harder to ignore. Maybe there's something about it that makes it sort of impossible to argue the context issue. Now the explanation evolves again. He was joking. He didn't mean literally, oh, you're taking him too seriously. Or it's just bravado. He's just trying to be tough. And if those things don't quite stick, then we go to the final move. Well, he's right. That's exactly the right thing. We need to do that if they don't capitulate. Even if that directly contradicts something that was said a day earlier or a week earlier or whatever. So think about that progression for a second. Not one explanation, a sequence of explanations, each one stepping in when the previous one stops working. That is another pattern. You see it all the time. And there are a couple of psychological concepts that I think help explain why this happens. The first one is motivated reasoning, which simply stated means people don't just process information to find the truth. They process information to arrive at a conclusion that feels acceptable to them. A conclusion that doesn't threaten their beliefs, their identity, their sense of being right. The second concept is one that you've probably heard of, cognitive dissonance. That's the discomfort you feel when two things you believe don't line up. When reality says one thing and your belief says another. And here's the key part. When people experience that discomfort, they have two options. They either change their belief or they reinterpret reality. Those are the two options. And changing the belief is really hard, especially in a system where you're supposed to demonstrate that your beliefs match his as much as possible. So what happens instead is the interpretation shifts. Not always consciously, I'm convinced, sometimes maybe not even deliberately, but consistently. Reality gets bent just enough to fit, whether that's a lot or a little. And when you zoom out, what you're looking at is a system that becomes very difficult to challenge from the outside, because every piece of contradictory information has a built-in response. It's like trying to nail Jell-O to the wall. You push one part and it just shifts somewhere else. Now, let me be clear about something here. This kind of thinking is not unique to one political group. Humans do this. All of us do it to a certain degree. We defend our beliefs, we rationalize, we justify. We try to protect our sense of being right. That's human. What's different here is the scale and the consistency, the speed with which these explanations appear, the number of people who are willing to adopt them, and the way they seem to move together almost in sync. And when you combine that with what we talked about earlier, identity at the base, loyalty reinforcement at the top, you get something that behaves less like a normal political system and more like a self-sealing one, where beliefs aren't being updated based on reality. Reality is being updated to protect the belief. And once that's in place, it sets the stage for something even more significant, because if reality itself has become negotiable, then the only thing left that isn't flexible is the person at the center of it. And that's where I'm going next. So let's take everything we've been building and bring it into focus. You've got identity at the base. You've got loyalty signaling at the top. You've got a system that can absorb contradictions almost effortlessly without breaking. Now ask yourself, what's the one thing in that system that doesn't move? What stays fixed while everything else adjusts and flexes around it? It's not the policies. It's not the facts. Certainly not the explanations. It's the person. And that's the shift. In most political systems, ideas come first. A politician lays out positions, whether they're on taxes or healthcare or foreign policy or whatever, and supporters align with those ideas. They may disagree on some details, sure, but there's a general expectation that the ideas are relatively stable. The politician is, in a sense, just the vehicle for those ideas. If the ideas change too drastically or start contradicting each other, that creates tension. It forces a conversion. Sometimes it will cost the particular politician's support. That's how it's supposed to work. But in this dynamic, it flips. The person comes first. And the ideas follow. Think about how often positions seem to shift, not gradually, not after long debate, but quickly, almost on cue. Something is said, and instead of people asking, wait, does that line up with what we believed yesterday? That's not the question. The question is, how do we understand this in a way that keeps everything consistent with him? Because consistency isn't being measured against reality anymore. It's being measured against the leader. And once that happens, contradiction stops being a problem. It becomes manageable. You can hold two opposing ideas at the same time as long as both are anchored to the same person. Now, I'm being serious. Think about that. In normal context, if a politician says one thing on Monday and the opposite on Friday, that would be an issue. That's something opponents would jump on. Supporters would have to try and grapple with it. But in this system, it just slides away. Monday gets reframed, Friday gets emphasized, or both get absorbed into a narrative that somehow, unbelievably, manages to make them both coexist at the same time. And this, again, this has nothing to do with a particular person's intelligence or lack of it. It's not about people being incapable of seeing contradictions. It's about what happens when your reference point shifts. When the anchor moves from what is true to what aligns with him, that's a fundamentally different way of processing information. And this is where that idea of leader infallibility creeps in. Not in some overt statement. No one stands up and says this person is perfect in every way, although a lot of them do come close to saying just that. But the idea of leader infallibility comes in much more subtle, durable form. If every inconsistency can be explained, if every contradiction can be reframed, if every challenge can be dismissed, then in practice it becomes very, very difficult for the leader to ever be wrong. Not because they never make mistakes, but because the system around them absorbs those mistakes before they have a chance to stick. And in that setting, debate changes. It's no longer, is this idea correct? It just simply becomes, how do we defend this idea? And that's a huge deal. And if you think about it, you're seeing it all the time. Because once the defense of a person becomes the priority, everything else, facts, consistency, even prior statements or beliefs, are all negotiable. They're all secondary. Now, again, this doesn't mean every single person, it doesn't mean every single person in the movement is doing this consciously. A lot of it just, you chalk it up to momentum, social pressure, the path of least resistance. But the pattern is hard to ignore. The leader becomes the constant. Everything else orbits around that. And once you've got that in place, politics start to feel a lot less like a discussion about ideas and a lot more like something else. Something you've probably seen before, just in a different context. So let's talk about that context. Because if what we've been describing so far feels familiar, there's a reason for that. You've seen this dynamic before, not just in politics. Think about sports. And I'm serious, stay with me on this. In sports, you've got teams. You've got colors and logos and jerseys, chants and rituals, entire identities built around affiliation. You're a Cowboys fan, you're a Red Sox fan, you're a Yankees fan, you're a Phillies fan, you're a Flyers fan, whatever. People don't just watch their team. They are their team. They say things like, we won last night. How did we do last night? Are we going to beat them this week? And maybe more importantly, it defines who they're against. The Eagles fans hate the Cowboys and vice versa. The Red Sox hate the Yankees and vice versa. And that part matters because it's not just about who you support, it's about who you oppose. Rivalries aren't just disagreements. They're emotional, personal. You would even say tribal on a certain level. Now think about how fans respond when their team does something questionable. Whether they get away with a dirty play or there's a bad call that goes in their favor. Most diehard fans don't step back and say, yeah, oh boy, that wasn't great. Maybe it happens sometimes, but most of the time they defend it. They explain it and minimize it and reframe it. Or they just shift focus. Well, yeah, but what about them? What about all the calls that went against them? What about all the dirty plays they had? Because at that point, it's not about the specific moment anymore. It's about the team. Loyalty comes first. Winning comes first. And winning doesn't just mean the scoreboard. It means beating the other side, proving them wrong, not giving them an inch. Now, take that framework and lay it over what I've been talking about. You've got identity signaling, merch symbols, constant visual affiliation. You've got loyalty performance, public displays of support and affirmation and alignment, sometimes regardless of the situation. You've got reality filtering, defending, reframing, and absorbing contradictions. You've got leader centrality, the person at the center becoming the anchor for everything else. At a certain point, that stops looking like citizenship and it starts looking like fandom. And I don't mean that as a cheap shot. I'm saying structurally. Because citizenship, at least in theory, is supposed to involve evaluation. You look at policies, outcomes, decisions. You agree with some things, you disagree with others. There's movement. You're supposed to be able to adjust. There's nuance. Fandom doesn't work like that. Fandom is about allegiance. You don't reevaluate your team every week based on their performance. You stick with them. Through the wins, through the losses, through the dirty plays and the questionable calls. Because your connection isn't just intellectual, it's emotional. It's identity. And now politics has started to take on that shape. And when it starts to operate on that level, something important changes because now being wrong isn't just about a policy being wrong. It's about your side being wrong. And if your side is wrong, well, what does that say about you? So the stakes have gotten higher and the defenses then have gotten stronger. And the space for disagreement has grown minuscule. Now, again, this isn't something that only happens in one political group. You see elements of it in lots of places, especially in highly polarized environments. But what we're looking at here is the concentration of these traits, the intensity, the way they stack on top of each other, because you combine identity and loyalty and emotional investment and a central figure. You don't just get strong political support. You get something that feels a lot more like belonging to a team. And once that shift happens, it explains so much. It explains why facts don't land the way you'd expect. It explains why contradictions don't ever put a dent in the system, let alone break it. It explains why criticism from the outside, no matter how good that criticism is, no matter how logical or reality-based it is, often makes the inside stronger instead of weaker. Because from the inside, it's not just about politics or ideas, it's us versus them. And in that kind of environment, changing your mind isn't just changing your opinion. It feels like switching teams. And that's a much, much harder thing to do. So the question becomes, why do people stay? Because it's really easy to sit outside of something like this. And by sitting outside of it, we'll use the example, let's say someone who's not MAGA. You sit outside of it and you say, why don't they just see it? Why don't they just step back and look at all the contradictions and all the lies and all the missteps and say, this just doesn't add up? On paper, that sounds simple. But in real life, it's anything but. Because leaving something like this, or even questioning it, isn't just an intellectual exercise. It's not just about changing your mind. It's about changing your identity. It's about all those things that I mentioned before. The merch, the symbols, the language, the shared beliefs, the sense of being part of something bigger. It's not just politics, it's community, it's belonging. And as humans, we're wired for that. We don't just want to be right, we want to be part of something. We want connection, we want shared purpose. We want to feel like we're not alone in how we see the world. So when you're inside a system like that, you're not just holding a set of opinions, you're holding onto relationships, friendships, family dynamics, social circles, your people. Now imagine what it takes to step back from that. Not just I disagree with this one thing, but I'm not sure this whole framework makes sense anymore. What happens next? Who do you talk to? Who do you trust? Who do you become if you're not that person anymore? Because here's the uncomfortable truth. For a lot of people, walking away doesn't just mean being wrong about something. It means losing a piece of who they are. It can mean losing their community, losing their sense of certainty, losing the emotional safety that comes from being aligned with a group of people that you feel united with. And that's a huge cost. It can be. And the human brain is really, really good at avoiding that kind of loss. Which brings us back to something that I touched on earlier, cognitive dissonance. That internal tension when something doesn't quite fit. When reality starts pressing against belief. In low-stakes situations, sure, you can adjust, you can update, you can move on. But when the belief is tied to your identity, when it's tied to your relationships and your sense of belonging, that is a whole different game. Now the brain goes into protection mode. It looks for ways to reduce that discomfort without blowing up the whole system. And that's where all those patterns we talked about start to make sense. The reframing, the deflection, the doubling down, not because people are incapable of understanding reality, but because accepting that reality comes with a cost that they may not be willing or even able to pay. And there's another layer here. A lot of people didn't get pulled into this kind of dynamic because they were looking for something extreme. They got pulled in because something about it resonated. Maybe it was frustration. Maybe it was feeling ignored. Maybe it was a sense that, the system wasn't working for them. And then they found something that felt like clarity. Something that felt like strength. Something that said, no, you're not crazy. You're right. And here is who to blame. And that is powerful. That's emotionally satisfying. And once you get that, once you've built relationships around that, once you've invested time and energy and money and belief into it, walking away isn't just difficult. It can feel like tearing down your entire framework for understanding the world. So people don't. They adapt, they rationalize, they stay. And again, we're talking mostly about one group here, I know, but it isn't unique to one group. This is human behavior. You can find versions of it in all kinds of movements across all kinds of contexts. But what we're looking at here is what happens when those tendencies get concentrated, when identity and loyalty and reinforcement and social pressure all point in the same direction. Because at that point, staying doesn't feel like a choice. It feels like the only thing that makes sense. And once you understand that, you stop asking, why don't they just leave? You start asking, maybe what's a much more honest question, what would it take to walk away? All right, so before I try and land this thing, we need to do something important, because if we don't, everything we just talked about becomes way too easy to dismiss. We've spent this entire episode walking through patterns and, identity, loyalty, reality filtering, leader centrality, all of it, and applying those patterns to the MAGA movement. And if you're listening to this, there's a decent chance that you've been nodding all along. Maybe even thinking, yeah, that tracks. But here's the thing. If that's all you take from this, then I've missed an opportunity, because none of what we talked about is exclusive to one political group. Not a single piece of it. Humans are wired for identity. We're wired for belonging. We're wired to defend our beliefs, especially when those beliefs are tied to who we are. You can see versions of this in all kinds of places. Maybe not to the degree that we're seeing it right now with, MAGA, but politics on the left, politics on the right, religious groups, social movements, fan communities, anywhere you've got strong identity and strong emotion and a sense of us versus them, you're going to see some version of the behaviors that I've been talking about. So if the takeaway from this episode is just those people are in a cult and we're not, that's too easy. And it completely misses the point. Because the real takeaway should be a little bit more unsettling than that. I think the real takeaway is these are human tendencies. And under the right conditions, they can show up anywhere. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean all groups express these tendencies in the same way or to the same degree. And that's where the distinction matters. What we're looking at here is the concentration of these behaviors, the intensity and the consistency, the way they all stack up and reinforce each other. Because you've got, again, identity signaling at the base, loyalty reinforcement at the top, a system that filters reality to protect belief, and a central figure that everything revolves around. You're not just looking at normal political support anymore. You're looking at something that starts to behave differently, something that starts to resist correction, that becomes harder and harder to challenge from the outside, especially from the outside. And that's the part that's worth paying attention to. Not because one group is uniquely flawed, but because it shows how powerful these dynamics can be when they all line up. So yeah, this isn't about pointing fingers in as much. It's not about saying they're the problem. It's about recognizing the pattern and understanding what happens when that pattern gets amplified. Because once you understand it, you can start to see it, not just in one place, but in a lot of places, anywhere it may start to take hold. So the next time you're watching a rally or a speech or scrolling through your feed, and you see the hats and the flags and the slogans and the certainty, the absolute unwavering confidence in one person, one message, one version of reality, just pause for a moment. Not to judge, not to dunk on it, not to score points, but just to notice. Notice how it's being presented. Notice how it's being defended. Notice how it feels from the outside looking in. Because once you start looking at it through this lens, it doesn't feel random anymore. It stops feeling like a whole series of isolated things. And it starts to look like a system built on identity, reinforced by loyalty, protected by the way information gets filtered and interpreted. And again, not every Trump voter. There are plenty of people who support him for reasons that pass understanding, but that have nothing to do with the things that I've been talking about today. But I'm talking about the hardcore MAGA subset. The patterns are all there. And once you see them, you can't really unsee them. So the question isn't just, is this right or wrong? The question is, at what point does political loyalty stop being about ideas and start being about a guy? At what point does disagreement become betrayal? At what point does support turn into identity? And maybe the most uncomfortable question of all, if you were inside something like that, would you recognize it? Because the hardest systems to see clearly are the ones that feel completely normal when you're standing in the middle of them. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for taking the time to download and listen to this episode of Your Neighbor on the Left. I want to hear from you. I want to know what your thoughts are on all of this. I want to know if you disagree with the things I said. I want to know if you have any critiques or compliments or questions or whatever. If you go to the podcast website, www.neighborontheleft.com, among other things, you can find a contacts page, and you can use any of the links for the social media platforms to send a direct message, or you can use the email address that's there to send an email and let me know what you're thinking. Let me know that you're out there listening. While you're at the website, you can also check out the episodes page where there's a web player and you can stream or download any episode of the podcast going all the way back to the beginning. And there is also a blog feature. The blog feature has posts that mimic the episodes of the podcast, but with one important twist. I list all of the sources that I use for my information. And in today's day and age, I think that's an important thing. So I'll be back on Friday with an installment of Back Porch Files. So between now and then, stay engaged, stay kind, and have the kind of week you'd wish for others.